Welcome again to Sunday Service and to those online. I'm reading from Rays of the One Light. These are weekly commentaries on the Bible and the Bhagavad Gita written by Swami Kriya-yoga based on the teachings of Paramahansa Yogananda. This week's reading is titled The Promise of the Scriptures. Truth is one and eternal. Realize oneness with it in your deathless self within. In the Gospel of St. Luke, chapter 15, we read the famous parable of the prodigal son. Jesus tells of the man who took the wealth bestowed on him by his father and squandered it in foreign lands, where he fell into evil ways. At last, repentant, he returned to his father's home. When his father saw him, he was, Jesus tells us, moved with compassion, and ran and fell upon his neck and kissed him. And his son said to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before thee. I am no longer worthy to be called thy son. But the father said to his servants, Fetch quickly the best robe and put it on him, and give him a ring for his finger and sandals for his feet. And bring out the fattened calf and kill it, and let us eat and make merry. Because this my son was dead, and has come to life again. He was lost and is found, and they began to make merry. Small-hearted human beings, identified as they are with their own little egos, give exaggerated importance to any slight they receive from others. Thus, they imagine God, like them, to be petty, unpardoning, and vindictive. In God's eyes, however, when human beings go astray, there is nothing to forgive. All of us are aspects only of His own self. He who made us resides in us. He is not far away from us in some far-off heaven. His call to us always is to return to our own home within. The way of return is described in the Bhagavad Gita. Supreme blessedness is that yogi's who has completely calmed his mind, controlled his ego-active tendencies, rajas, and purged himself of desire, thereby attaining oneness with Brahma, the infinite spirit. Thus, through Holy Scripture, God has spoken to mankind. Om, Om, Om.
This is the promise of the Scriptures, because Jesus is telling us that...
Turn off the monitor, please.
He's telling us to please turn off the monitor. Jesus is telling us that no matter what we've done, no matter how ugly it's gotten, He is there for us. He's always there waiting just to take us in. I was reflecting when we did the purification ceremony a little while ago that we say, open your heart. The Master is saying, open your heart to me, and I will enter and take charge of your life. That's all we have to do. We just have to turn to Him. We just have to want Him. That's why we played that beautiful chant, I want only Thee. And we may think, well, there's quite a few things that I want. I really need a new car, and I really need a dishwasher, and all these things that we think are going to give us something back, going to help us in some way. But what do the things of the world really give us? That's what the prodigal son is saying. He went out from his father's house Yogananda explains that this means the soul, when it's first created, it goes out from its father's house. It's been given this wealth of God consciousness, but it goes out into materialism. It goes out into the world, going after every little shiny, sparkly thing until it realizes that none of those things can give it anything in return. So it squanders its wealth, squanders God consciousness, and becomes poor and hungry of spirit. The rest of the Bible reading talks about, thank you, talks about how this poor boy has lost all of his wealth and gambling and riotous living, and he's so poor, he's so hungry that he takes a job feeding, they call it husks, to the pigs. I don't know what those husks are, but the boy was so hungry he wanted them. He wanted what he was feeding to the pigs, he wanted to eat himself, but no one would offer them to him. And so he was bereft, starving, and poor of spirit. And so he thought to himself, well, at my father's house, even the servants have something to eat. Let me beg my father's forgiveness and ask him to just hire me. We ask God just to take us in any bit of us. We'll just serve him. We'll just wash the floors and sweep the path. But instead, God lifts us up and says, my child, you've come back to me. It's one of the most moving passages in the scripture. And that's why I always say the scriptures are love letters written to each one of us to tell us we are not alone. We have resource. It may feel as though our bank accounts are depleted and we have no friends and we have nothing, but we have God always. And not just God the Almighty, like is painted on the Sistine Chapel looking pretty ferocious, but God our friend, God our parent, God who knows us better than we know ourselves. And as last week's passage said, he knows us and what we need before we even know it ourselves. Swami used to quote St. John Vianney as saying, if you knew how much God loves you, you would die of joy. So we have nothing to fear in this world. God is ever at our side, waiting to help us. We just have to turn our minds and open our hearts to that energy that's right there. Swami used to also say, God made us, God made the pitfalls, and he's not surprised when we fall into them. He made them. He knows. It's part of the game. But if we trust in him, he's right there. So there's we always pray to saints and sages of all religions. And this is a story about a humble little devotee from the Buddhist tradition. And this devotee's name was Gongpo Ben. He was from the Gongpo region of Tibet. And that region, in the centuries ago, was known for people of devotion, but not of high intellect. So Ben was just very humble little farmer, peasant, but he dreamed about going on pilgrimage and seeing the golden, smiling Buddha of Lhasa. And he really wanted to go there. And one day he just said, okay, I'm going. He put on his traveling boots and he set off for very distant Lhasa. And he finally got there bone weary, but he was in awe of the palace and all the monasteries. Two of the oldest and greatest monasteries in all of Tibet are there in Lhasa. And he felt that he was in the city of the gods. He was full of wonder and delight, seeing all these holy places. And he made his way to the center of Lhasa, where the temple is, where the smiling golden Buddha, very, very huge Buddha, is placed. And he made his way through, no one stopped him, and he went right into the Holy of Holies. And there was the Buddha. And he prostrated himself and was just in awe of being there and finally seeing with his own eyes this smiling Buddha towering over him. And he made his prostrations, and then he started to circumambulate the great statue. And as he did so, he was the only one in this Holy of Holies, he noticed that there were rows and rows of butter lamps, lighted ghee lamps in front of and all around the Buddha. And then there were also rows and rows of these offerings of barley cakes. And Ben thought to himself, what hospitality! The Buddha has provided this food for me. And so he happily, first of all, he decided to take off his cap and his boots so that he could circumambulate the temple more easily. And he tossed them up into the lap of the Buddha. And he said, keep an eye on these for me. And then he sat down and he started dipping the barley cakes into the ghee lamps and eating them. And he was just so thrilled with the intimate presence of the Buddha and feeling this warmth of hospitality and love emanating from this statue. And as he was sitting there eating, suddenly a ray of sunlight burst into the dimly lighted temple, and there was the temple caretaker. And the door had just sort of flung open as if by some power, as if some self-righteous entity had come into the scene of the crime and wondered what was going on. So this caretaker went up to the Buddha and saw all the ghee lamps and the cakes just in disarray. They had been so orderly and perfect, and now they were just all over the place. And then he saw the hat and the boots in the Buddha's lap. And he was outraged. So he went up to take them out, to snatch them away from that unholy place. And he heard a voice, a deep, imperious voice, saying, "Hands off. Those belong to my disciple from Gungpo." And the caretaker was stunned, and he realized that it had been a miracle that he had witnessed, and he prostrated himself, begging forgiveness, and contemplating this miracle, he left. Well, Ben was vindicated. The Buddha had protected his boots, just like he wanted him to. And moreover, he was so happy to be there eating and being with the Buddha that he invited him to come for dinner at his house in Gongpo. Well, eventually Ben left the temple, went back home, and sometime later he was at a beautiful crystal clear spring that ran near his very humble little house. And looking into the water, he saw the face of the Buddha, of the smiling golden Buddha. And he reached in to try to pull the statue out and take it home with him. But it was so heavy that he couldn't bear the weight and he dropped it. And that statue became embedded into a huge stone that the people of Gongpo still worship. They circumambulate that statue and feel that even though the smiling Buddha is in distant Lhasa, where most of them will never go, they know that the Buddha resides there with them. So, what we need to feel is that the Buddha, God, our Guru, however we want to think of God, is always right there with us, never far away. And if we hold him close to our hearts, everything will open up in life. Everything will be a joy. There have been wonderful stories of people who, in terrible adverse circumstances, found comfort, found joy. I've often mentioned this, but I had the privilege of meeting Richard Wurmbrand, who is a Romanian saint who was imprisoned by the communists for his Christian faith. And they chained him, they tortured him daily, but he felt the presence of Christ so strongly, so powerfully, that at one point he started dancing with joy and using his chains like cymbals to keep time for his dancing. And the overwhelming love and joy that he experienced transmitted to the other prisoners, who also started dancing with joy, and their guards, their torturers, ran away in fear. So that powerful love is what we're here to feel, to understand, to make our own.
This story is one of the classic stories of Christianity, and it's certainly one that I remember growing up with. And I had this experience when I was maybe, I want to say about 4 or 5 years old. And my family was on a little holiday trip to Wisconsin, to one of the little lakes in Wisconsin. And we had a little cottage in a row of cottages, and there was like a street, 2 or 3 streets that had these little cottages on them. And so we had one just kind of in the middle of everything. Well, being a precocious little guy, I was interested in exploring the neighborhood. So I did, and I wandered off. Well, you're 4 years old, whatever. You're not necessarily paying attention to where you're going. And so I got, 1 or 2 streets over, and I didn't know where I was. They all looked the same, and it was like, whoa. this is not good. This is way too scary. And I just let this wail out. It's like default setting, wail. And within, and of course people come running. It's like, oh my God, and kids crying. This is, as you might imagine, this was not the era of Child Protective Services. This was long before Child Protective Services was invented or dreamed of, as far as I can tell. But there were lots of parents and families. This is a place where it was by a little lake, Green Lake, I think it was called. And, lots of families and kids. And of course, every parent just kind of comes, God, what are we going to do with this kid? Well, and none of them are going to be able to answer the call. But my dad heard and found me, 2 blocks over, whatever, hoisted me up, took me home. And, it makes me think of that experience that the prodigal son had. Nirmala told part of the story. I'll just add another piece of it, which is that, so he's off, he's burned through all his inheritance in foreign lands, and he doesn't have anything to eat. He goes to feed the swine. He's starving. And he has the realization, like she was saying, geez, anybody in my father's, compound, the servants, they all have clothes to wear, shoes for their feet, food to eat. It's like it all works out. Even if at the lowest level, you're still going to be okay. So he rehearses his little speech. I will say to my father, and he goes through all the little lines. I have sinned before heaven, and I am no longer worthy to be called Jesus. Hire me as a servant, blah, blah, blah. And when he gets home, he repeats the exact words. It's like, I got this worked out now. I'm going to say my little speech. He says his little speech. And Dad is like, what? You're home. Now, there's a follow-up to this, too, which is kind of intriguing, because the older brother is there. Anybody remember the older brother? Now, he's not so, he comes in, and it's like there's all this commotion going on. It's like the music, M-U-S-I-C-K. You got to love the old English. Anyway, the music is playing, and the fatted calf has been killed, and it's like big commotions. He's like, what is happening? And he sees his brother, and it's like, you. And he goes to the father, and he basically says, look, I have been here the whole time. I have served you every single day and did exactly what you wanted me to do. And now what is all this? You never gave me a fatted calf. You never put the ring on my finger. You never did, blah, 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 blah. You never did any of that stuff. And the dad is like, that's not the point. The point is that this one who was lost has been found, was dead and is now alive. And it's very sweet, because it's, the corollary in our lives is that we all went, and we're going to hear it in a few minutes in the Festival of Light. We've all gone on this journey. We've all gone away from God. We've all gone into the illusion of life. And we're trying to find our way back out of it. And we think that we're just hosed. We think that we're just out of luck, or that we're no good, or that we've, those who were raised in certain traditions, that we are sinners. And Yogananda flatly said the greatest sin is to call yourself a sinner. Now, being a sinner could be, just to say, could be a fact. It could be a fact. The guy who went off to the foreign lands and spent all his money on riotous living, he wasn't doing so great while he was out there. He kind of messed it up. Okay, the fact was he was a sinner in that moment. That is not the truth, however. This is one of those points that's a subtle difference. Fact and truth are not the same thing when they diverge. And he's still a child of God, as are we all. We have all of us missed something. And I remember this little example of this from when we lived in India. There was a girl who used to keep house for us, mainly just cleaning. And she would come, she was about 16 years old. I don't think she might not have been that old, but she said she was, and we couldn't verify any other way. They didn't have birth certificates and, etc. Sumitra was her name. And one day she came in, she didn't speak English, she spoke Bengali, and Swami was the only one who could communicate with her because his Bengali was fluent, or fluent enough at this point. The rest of us were at zero. Anyway, she came one day and she was not in a good space at all. I mean, she was crying, she was sniffling. I tried to offer her a Kleenex and we, sign language. I realized she did not know how to blow her nose. That was not part of her training. Anyway, so she was just sniffling and she was a mess. And finally we got Swami. Swami came down and saw this and started asking her in Bengali what was happening, because it was clear that something was up. Well, her little nephew, her sister's little baby child had just died, like yesterday or something. And she was very distraught, and completely understandably. I think they all lived in one big house, or one small house, but I mean, they were all there together. So, I mean, this was very intimate for her life. And what was he going to say? She was I remember this specifically because she was sitting at his feet, which would have been very natural for her to do if she's talking with him, which she almost never did, but still, in that moment, it was like it was an unscripted moment. You couldn't predict this situation, and so she realized that the rules were a little different for the next 5 minutes or so. So she was sitting at his feet. She was petting his little slippers, because they were sort of like Jan's coat here. They were very fluffy. They were very fuzzy. And it was the most endearing thing. She was just sort of petting his foot. And, and he was talking with her very lovingly. I mean, this only went on for like 3 to 5 minutes. And then it was time for her to get back to doing, but he was very comforting and sweet with her. What struck me about the interaction was he could not make the baby come back to life. He could not explain to a 16-year-old girl who had never experienced death so close to hand and so impactfully. He couldn't remove that from her. He couldn't explain to her the bigger picture of death as a part of life, blah, blah, blah. None of that could he give her. He could only give her love and support in that moment. And then it was going to be time for the day to continue, which it did. What struck me is that we are all of us Sumitra. We are all of us 16 years old, still trying to figure out what's going on, and we've lost something very dear, very precious to us. Something that felt like our own. And it's gone, and there's nothing we can do to retrieve it in that moment. We are also, this is the challenging part of the little description, we are also all of us Swami. Because we've all encountered Sumitras in this world who have lost something very dear and precious. And we have the opportunity to try to give comfort, love, support, compassion, etc. And if it comes, and to the degree that we're able to offer it sincerely, then something beautiful comes in the exchange. But that realization that God is with us all the time and that we just have to approach, and Nirmala hit it. She said, open your heart to me, like we say in the purification. We have to just approach God with an open heart. This beautiful story of the devotee, the Buddhist devotee who comes to find the smiling Buddha, throws his boots on the Buddha. Bad juju, not done. But The rules of the heart are different when the heart is completely open, because he wasn't approaching the Buddha as somebody else. It was his own Buddha. He came to his own. When we come to God, we come to our very own. We all of us look for that sense of belonging, that sense of connectedness, that sense that I am exactly where I'm supposed to be. And, and this pervades all of life. I read a story recently that was so touching in such an unexpected way. There's a story about a parrot, and this parrot was being trained. It was extraordinarily intelligent. They taught this parrot 100 words, and you could actually have a conversation, a limited conversation with the parrot. Well, at one point, this parrot lived to be 30. This is totally news to me, which is young, died young at the age of 30. Parrots can live to be 100. I had no concept. The parrot asked the question that even monkeys and chimpanzees and other animals that are known to be quite intelligent have never been known to ask. He asked, "What color am I?" And they tried 6 different times to explain, and he finally understood, "I am gray. My color is called gray." And he was. And his last words, this is of his own doing, he said, "Be good. I love you." From a parrot, for God's sakes. I mean, you think, good grief. I mean, if a bird can do that, Christ in the Bible says every sparrow is counted. Every hair on your head, assuming that you have any, every hair on your head is counted, for God's sakes. So of course we're going to be accepted. Of course we're going to have that connection. We just have to get our heads out of the husks that we're trying to feed the swine and figure out, what, this is not working out so good. Let's get back to where we're supposed to be, which is in the spine, which is in the bliss of God. And then we get maybe it's tofu, not a fatted calf. I don't know, whatever it works out. I mean, it works out to be a good party, however you want to conceive of that. Fill in the blank however it works for you, but it works out really, really well. God bless you.
He who would slake his thirst now and forever, let him not fill his cup here from this well, from living water, sipped in the silence, in spirit and in truth, break ego's spell. Though fallen deep in sin, by man abandoned, if longing for his grace, truth be your guide, he can redeem. Let's start again.
Yeah, that was...
Can you give us an arpeggio there? Altos? Though fallen deep in sin, He